All right. Going to give it a few minutes for people to start streaming in. There we go. All right. Well, hopefully the rest of the attendants can stream in while I start. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar in collaboration with Viresco Solutions. This is our second part of our two-part series on Scope 3, and today's webinar will focus on the real-world challenges of implementing a Scope 3 project. I'm Mr. Taco, Director of Technology and Development for Field to Market Canada, and it is my pleasure to be your host today. We would like to thank Viresco Solutions for co-hosting this event with us. And since this is a very important and complex topic, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar in our Q&A. But we would like to ask you to wait until the speaker has finished their section before we start asking questions. We'll then move on to a Q&A segment where you can pose your questions, followed by a short wrap-up. And however, before we begin, I would like to introduce our antitrust statement. It is Field to Market Canada's strict policy to fully comply with both the letter and the spirit of all applicable provincial, federal, and international antitrust laws. Because competitors may be present at this meeting, several topics of conversation must be avoided. In general, the types of discussions that must not occur are those that may suggest or imply agreements among competitors with respect to prices, terms of sale, discounts, credit, or any other such items that may impact prices. Other topics that must be avoided include the allocation of customers, markets or territories, bid rigging, and group boycotts or joint refusal to do business with others. Field to Market Canada will conduct this meeting in a manner that complies with all applicable antitrust laws. And if at any time during the course of this meeting, participants believe that a topic prohibited under the antitrust laws is being discussed or is about to be discussed, they should advise me or anyone in the Viresco Solutions team. And we will halt any further discussions and move on to a different topic. Thank you very much for your time. I will now pass it on to Nora from Viresco.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Taco. I'm just going to share my slides here. All right, just confirming that everyone else can see these slides. Yep, okay.
Yep.
Great. Hello, my name is Nora Ellis, and I am a project manager here at Viresco Solutions. Viresco is a Canadian-based environmental consulting firm with over 15 years in greenhouse gas accounting, carbon markets, and sustainable agriculture experience. Today, my colleagues Wilson Fink, the Manager of Advisory Services, and Teresa Heineke, Senior Technical Lead, will be delivering the second Scope 3 for Agri-Food workshop in this mini-series. We're very pleased to join the Field to Market Network to support its goals by sharing some of our insights and expertise, and are very excited to present to this group today. Now, before we jump right in, I just want to take a minute to zoom out a little bit. I know Scope 3 can sometimes feel like just another reporting requirement or another layer of complexity to top everything else that's going on in sustainability, but we're really talking about something much bigger here. This is the first time we're seeing companies seriously engage with their emissions outside their own walls. So into their supply chains, onto farms, into real world production systems. And that's where most of the impact actually sits. And something to note is that shift isn't going away, not because of any one regulation or framework. Those will continue to evolve, but because the underlying pressures aren't changing. Companies still need to meet climate targets. Investors and customers still expect credible progress. And the reality is, if you simply can't address emissions at the start, you need to scale and engage with that value chain. So whether it's called Scope 3, value chain emission reductions, insets, or something else in the next few years, this way of working is here, which means the question is now how? How do we do it? So how do we design something that actually works in practice? How do we make it credible without making it impossible to implement? And how do we do it in a way that creates value across the system, not just for one player? So that's what today is about. In part one of the series, we focused on the fundamentals. So we covered what Scope 3 is, why it matters, and how it shows up across the agri-food value chain. And then we also looked at some of the key accounting concepts. Today, we're shifting more into what implementation actually looks like. So quick look at today's agenda. We'll start by walking through a Scope 3 ag food program and what it looks like in practice. And then we'll look at where hotspots tend to sit, and followed by that, we'll get more into the program structure, partnerships, and financial models. Afterwards, we'll look at implementation. So this includes producer engagement, GHG quantification, data and verification. And then we'll finish with some pre-prompted questions that we often get from our clients, and finish with questions from the audience. So feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go so we can remember them at the end. Okay, so I'm going to jump right into an example of a carbon inventory for a CPG protein company. So this is often where we start. Like once we know where hotspots lay, we can start thinking about how we can reduce those emissions. So what you're seeing here is a breakdown across Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1, this is from our last call, being the direct emissions from owned or controlled sources, accounts for about 10.3% of total emissions. And then looking at our little Scope 2, that gray bubble there, those are indirect emissions. So those are from purchased electricity, heat, or steam, very small, sitting at just 0.4%. And then the real story is at Scope 3. So at roughly 89.3%, this represents the vast majority of a company's footprint. These emissions sit upstream and downstream in the value chain, so they can be third-party contracted growers, feed production and packaging materials, and anything else in that rather large list on the green side there. And doing something like this, seeing the inventory, shows us where the hotspots are. And once we can see them clearly, we can start designing programs that actually target and reduce them. So I'll quickly just flash this Scope 3 program model, and this shows the architecture of a Scope 3 program. So how intervention, implementation, data, quantification, and MRV all connect. And then when these pieces work together, we can actually translate the on-farm action into credible product-linked impact. And I know that's easier said than done, so I'm going to let Wilson kind of take us through these components and talk more in depth about each of them. So go ahead, Wilson.
Sounds good. Yeah, you'll notice that this isn't a linear process. So I'm going to start us off by actually just talking through some of the key kind of questions that are worth asking when you're starting to just go down this journey as a company, because you're going to be starting from, different places depending on, where you sit in the value chain, depending on where you, operate your supplier with your suppliers, and who you sell to, and all these different questions you might have are going to affect, I guess, your role in the supply chain program, and what kind of pressures you have. Are you getting questions from, your downstream partners? Are you trying to align with a Scope 3 target that you've set in the past against SBTI, for instance? Or are you just trying to get more insight into your value chain and understand how to use the data with purpose? So we've kind of framed this with 4 sort of key concepts or questions or considerations to think about as you're just starting to get going on scope 3. So the first one being this question of materiality. So is there a large enough hotspot to justify the effort? And Nora showed us the example from the food company, but you do want to make sure that whatever you're impacting, it's going to actually have a material effect on the emission reductions. So both in terms of like just actual emissions reduced, but then also relative to your inventory, is this going to make a material change in your, scope 3 outcomes as a company? So that'll be the first thing. And you can do that without really investing too much money because you can estimate a lot of these emission reductions from the outset and figure out, what makes the most sense. The second question on reach is, whether or not you have a line of sight into the growers that you are planning to do this intervention with. So do you have direct traceability? Would you need some kind of intermediary like an agronomy team or a sales team or, feed nutritionists if you're working in the livestock sector or other, livestock specialists to coordinate that on your behalf because you may not have that direct connection to the operations themselves. But you will need an intermediary if you don't, because that relationship with the actual, sustainable activity and the people who conduct them is very important. And the third one is around methodology. So the question of how do we actually quantify the emission reductions and how do we make sure that these are applicable to the activities that we're now considering is also an important one. And so this is something worth considering from the very beginning because if there's an existing methodology, it makes it much easier for you to quantify those emission reductions. And if you don't have one, then you're looking at either doing some sort of protocol development process or you're going to be dealing with other challenges with the quantification and around credibility. But there are options there, but it's certainly worth mapping out the interventions you have planned to the applicable protocols and then the eligibility criteria that live within those. And then lastly, we have partner landscape. So is there a willingness within the ecosystem to construct a program like this? Are you already getting asked by partners to deliver on some of this information, or do you need to foster those relationships from the beginning? And so you don't necessarily start with any one of these. You sort of have to figure all of them out over time. And I think the process not being linear makes it a little bit tricky, but these questions should help you to then put together a feasibility assessment and start to assess what a value case might look like. And so here we have a very high level kind of overview of what a project implementation process could look like. And so how we often construct these is by looking at these various different work streams within a project. So starting off with kind of project initiation, this is something that can kick off in a matter of, a month or a few months. And it's really just setting up the goals, the objectives of the program, defining the scope, and, figuring out who's all going to be involved there. Just one note on the timeline here, we put 12 months as like the timeline, but obviously these are going to vary a lot depending on the kind of program you're doing, and many will be intentionally designed to be multi-year programs. Often these are constructed around a crop season or a crop cycle, so each annual reporting period would be structured around a harvest. At least in Canada, we only have one harvest a year, so it's typically constructed that way. In the feed sector or the livestock sector, you might be dealing with different animal cohorts, which don't necessarily map onto like a standard 12-month period. So these timelines will obviously be affected by your specific program, but just to give you a sense of how long some of these things take, we thought we'd try to put some estimates on here, but initiation doesn't take too long. And then you can get into the administrative stuff. So setting up your secured SharePoint for data storage. You can set the meeting cadence, figure out the project roles and responsibilities, and then assign project governments and the project implementation team. On the communications work stream, this is really about setting up the engagement with the participants in the program. So building out FAQ documents and putting out that communication strategy for all the stakeholders involved. So that would be the farmers or livestock producers or feed companies. That would be any of the partners upstream or downstream of the boundary that we're dealing with, because they might also be involved. And then, communicating with any of the other partners, like if there's a soil sampling entity, they would come into that, that question. There might be a media release in the beginning to just kind of say the program's kicking off. And then later on, once you've had the project success, you can communicate that to the broader public as well. So just talking about what you accomplished. The financial work stream is another important one. So this is about figuring out the different payment structures to the different entities and figuring out who they apply to, and I guess what would trigger a payment if you're a producer actually implementing these activities. Do you get paid partially up front for signing up? Do you get paid when you submit data? Do you get paid when the outcomes are generated, or on a per ton, of carbon reduced, or is it on the hectares that you enroll? Like, there's all these different ways you could structure these contracts. And so having that established early is important, as well as any other fees associated with the program operator. There may be other entities like banks or green financing involved, or involvement with different other investors, or clean tech companies and that sort of thing. So understanding just how the financial flows are going to work will be important. And then the data management. So you'll see this has sort of two timelines associated with it. One is the initial kind of build out of that, data requirements and monitoring list. So figuring out all the different parameters you need to actually quantify the outcomes. That will go back in time a little bit. So you'll see the orange box on the baseline question. You do typically need to collect some historical data to construct the counterfactual scenario. So you'll go back in time a little bit. Depending on the protocol you use, it might be up to 3 or even 5 years, but sometimes it's only a single year. And then you'll start to collect that information over the course of the program. And actually, really up until the final piece of data is complete, you'll be dealing with this monitoring question. And actually, even post-harvest, there's some monitoring questions that still remain, like, are they doing fall tillage or cover cropping and that sort of stuff. So the monitoring never really stops. And there's easier and more challenging ways of doing it. So if you can utilize remote sensing options, for example, then that makes it easier. But setting up that data management strategy from the beginning is key. Just below that is the crop and livestock and agronomy team. So these will be the folks that actually engage with the producers, in the barns, on the fields, and help them to, make that practice change to reduce emissions. They'll also help them with any data collection questions and helping them learn how to use the platforms if there's a new kind of software or app that they're using to input that data. And they're kind of the direct contact if any of these producers have questions throughout the program. And so they're often, leveraged because they already have these relationships, these trusted relationships in the first place. So they're a very important team to keep up to speed on the project as it evolves. Quantification in MRV is really about actually estimating the emission reductions from the beginning, and then later on confirming those with modeled or calculated outputs, and pulling in other sources of information like soil sample data sets, or climate data, things that feed into these GHG models, or maybe pulling from emission factor databases like EcoInvent. Again, you'll sort of set it up in the beginning, but then it'll be later in the year or after you've got all that data come in that you do the bulk of the work on the quantification. And finally, reporting and assurance. This is the last step that you need to do in order to submit to a VVB, which is an acronym for verification and validation body, or certification body, assurance mechanism. We have different terms for these types of entities, but basically they'll be the ones who do some sort of third-party independent review on your results. And so they'll look at the outcomes, they'll look at the data collection process, they'll sort of review the whole project and then sign off on it after a few reviews. So that's, in a nutshell, what a project can look like, but we'll get into more of these details now as we move forward. Oh, it's not showing me it didn't give me the option to, I'm just gonna have to back up for a second. So engaging the value chain is something I want to talk about before we get into implementation as well, because it really does take a village to set one of these programs up. So a few key points I just wanted to hit was that the producers really are the focal point of the implementation, and these are the main people that are actually doing the sustainable practice change, often taking on the risk and collecting the bulk of the data. So they have a lot of work involved with this. So having them be supported is very important. And then the supply chain will set the scope. So what that means is you have your farm boundary, but there's also other entities and partners that'll be involved in a Scope 3 program that may be up or downstream of the farm. And they play an important role too, because they will perhaps provide low emission fertilizers, or they might, provide emission factors for different fuel sources. They might be investors. They might later be buying the goods from the farm and then doing more processing, and there could be interventions there. So the impacts around the value chain could expand beyond the farm. Other GHG partners can bolster accuracy and credibility. So this is just a point about having MRV solutions help create evidence for the different practices, and then going through kind of a third-party verification will be important. So working with VVBs. And then the data and assurance, that really doesn't stop. So that's from kind of day one up until your last monitoring period. You'll have to be very focused on data quality and doing a lot of QA/QC management and gap filling. And lastly, the point I was just going to make is that co-investment is a very key lever in these programs to work financially, because if you saw the first webinar, we talked about how a farm can exist in many different companies, Scope 3 categories. So where a company might be supplying to a farm, that would be in their Scope 3 inventory, but then also when somebody buys from that farm, they'd be in the Scope 3 inventory. So there's these overlapping interests in those farm emissions and the products that are both produced from the inputs, but then also are sold off the farm. And what that means is there's a big opportunity for co-investment and collaboration, where we can, share the investment into the program, and we all benefit from these lower emission factors, or lower product carbon footprints, or just lower tons, of emissions reduced as reported as like a verified impact unit, or other kind of issuance that looks like an inset credit. So co-investment is really important for these projects to be financially viable. And I'll try to just explain a little bit more about these partnerships with some diagrams. So the project proponent here sits in the middle as kind of like the general contractor that pulls everybody together. And then the primary producer, or the barn, or the livestock producer, or the feed mill, or the farmer, these are going to be a key intervention point where sustainable practices mostly take place. And so having a relationship with them is very important. There may be an intermediary needed there if you don't have that direct traceability, but in any case, the producer is critical there. And that producer exists within a supply chain that has other, relevant participants. So upstream of the farm, the people who manufacture inputs that are later sold to the producer, as well as the input suppliers, because these companies will be selling to a farm, they're concerned about the use of their sold products. So as a fertilizer or fuel company, it's how is this product getting used, and could it be used more efficiently, because I have to account for the emissions associated with my fertilizers when they get placed in the soil, for instance. And then downstream of the farm, you have people buying from the farm. And so these would be aggregators and processors. They will be, elevators, feedlots, things like that, groups like that. That's purchased goods and services for them. So that's their category 1 emissions. And same downstream from them would be the food and feed manufacturing. So any CPG company that's making bread or yogurt or beer or anything like that, that would be of interest to them. You know what happens on the farm, and you could even go further and talk about the retailers and the grocers. But that's sort of what the supply chain could look like at a high level. And then you have different entities come in providing other services like GHG quantification and MRV solutions. So they might be pulling in remote sensing data, soil carbon collection data. They could be responsible for sourcing different emission factors from an emission factor database, and likewise on the right-hand side, they could be doing or providing the platform for the producer to actually provide the primary data. So things like Climate Field View or ZaraView Field Manager or FCC's Ag Expert. And sort of fitting within both of these actually is Field to Market's Field Print Calculator, because they both serve as a data input tool as well as a quantification engine. So, there's a lot of different actors in these two spaces, and they all do sort of different things, but there's no shortage of options actually these days for MRV solutions. And above them is the assurance and certification team. So that would be the VVB, the standards and registries, and data will flow between, the MRV providers, the producers, and then, the project proponent who sort of sits in the middle of everybody. Data will flow towards that verifier. And then there will also be some back and forth between the VVB and the project proponent. And finally, we have other financial institutions or governments, NGOs that might be interested in the project. So the Nature Uniteds or the Ducks Unlimited, those kinds of groups often play important roles in establishing these kinds of projects as well. So on the financials and kind of the cost benefits, I won't spend a ton of time here, but I just wanted to highlight some of the key costs and benefits for some of the core stakeholders. So the farmers or the folks dealing with the interventions, at the barn or wherever, are going to have some important costs related to practice implementation. So if they're planting cover crops, or if they're using a methane inhibitor with the cattle, or if they're changing their feed ingredients, then those have potentially heavy operational costs. And maybe new equipment is needed, or different specialists required to make sure that it doesn't affect yield or productivity. So some of those costs, I think, are the important ones. Also, the data collection and reporting is a big one. It's not necessarily expensive in terms of like dollar amounts, but it's very annoying to farmers to have to provide this data, and it's often not timely, because the most important data that you need often comes when they're the busiest, so at planting or at harvest. And so for them, it's a big kind of labor irritant. And so one of the big costs is just, having to report all that information. But they do benefit through direct incentives. You can structure that in various ways: dollar per hectare, dollar per ton, so forth. But there's also, ideally yield and input efficiency upsides, and access to premium markets. With the program operators, providing those incentives to the producers is a big cost. Soil sampling is a big one, and then any GHG modeling could also be a big one. There are less expensive options for those that don't require the modeling or the soil sampling. So there are, these expenses are very variable, but those would be the big ones. But they can also benefit from program, operational delivery fees. They might get a share of the inset value, or just strengthen their supply chain position more generally if it gives them an opportunity to market their services or products to the growers of interest. So there's kind of a whole value case, a value proposition, I think, for the program operator that we did touch on in the first webinar as well. But those would be the key benefits on the variable side, and then having the model be repeatable and scalable is also a benefit. And then for the downstream buyers, actually, also for the upstream buyers, some of the benefits would be that they can bring their scope 3 emissions down. They can market lower carbon intensity products, and then get some brand or market differentiation. And they also get an insight into the data that's more detailed than they would have had otherwise. So they can actually see a lot of the real, on-farm primary data that they might not have had access to before. But the costs are payment for scope 3 reductions, and then any product premiums, if applicable. So on the, just on the scale and stacking interventions to point, the 2 points at the bottom here. Scaling and stacking is very important for the project kind of overall economics. So it does dilute the fixed costs, and then it increases the abatement. So you get more, emission reductions per hectare or per animal or whatever it is that you're dealing in. And so I think if you can bring in multiple interventions, like you're dealing with upstream fertilizer manufacturing, you're also dealing with on-farm activities and maybe using other product substitutions, and you bring everybody together, that's really when these projects show profitability and ROI. So we're almost through the project structure section, but there's 2 more slides I just want to talk through that describe those 2 key differences in project types that I sort of alluded to a second ago, which is product substitution. So that's we're calling kind of path A here in blue, and practice change or more like activity-based changes under path B, which is in green. And they're different in important ways, and we don't often see them described this way, but it's something we're seeing more and more of, is these 2 approaches sort of merging and programs actually being able to implement both at the same time. And so the first one is a bit simpler. So the substitution basically is just taking using a different product and substituting in place of an old product because it has a lower emissions intensity or emission factor. So you could use green or blue ammonia fertilizers and replace your gray urea or your conventionally produced fertilizer. And it's chemically, its composition is exactly the same, so there's no change for the farmer. They just have to buy a different product or procure a different product, but they don't actually change the way they use it in terms of 4Rs or anything like that. Likewise, you could do, in a livestock operation, you could substitute pulses in place of other feed ingredients that are higher in carbon intensity. In this example, there's a bit more nuance around making sure that the meat quality doesn't change and that the productivity of the animal doesn't change, because it's not an exactly identical product, but it is, similar, and you're making sure that all those feed specs don't change and that the productivity and everything is similar. So it's another kind of substitution, but with a bit more safeguards. And then other examples would be like renewable diesel or HVO fuels that just plug straight into farm equipment. And the quantification for this is very simple, because you're basically just looking at the activity volume and then multiplying that by whatever the emission factor is. And this very easily substitutes into a GHG inventory as well. So if you're a company that's already got a scope 3 inventory and you're dealing with these kinds of emissions, you're probably using this approach anyway. And so when you do a project like this, you're basically just updating these emission factors in your inventory. And so it's quite simple and pretty low cost. Whereas path B requires a bit more detail around data collection, around MRV, because you're dealing with practices that aren't so easily quantified. Like, for instance, if you're doing a cover crop or you're doing 4R nutrient management, or manure management with livestock, it's not a simple equation like that, and it so often requires some kind of calculator or even a biogeochemical model that can actually model the SOC changes over time, with uncertainty parameters, and takes real soil sampling as inputs. And so it's a much more complicated kind of process, but it does allow you to quantify those interventions that you wouldn't get with the more basic emission factor approaches. So there's pros and cons to each, and if you want to maximize your abatement per hectare, then this would be, merging these 2 approaches would be the best way to do that. And I do have an example that shows these processes that we were just talking about here. So we have just under the generic process, you identify the intervention, you establish a baseline, so figure out what were the practices before the intervention, and then we would do the quantification, produce a new emission factor, implement the changes, all that kind of stuff around MRV, take it through an assurance process, and then integrate those into a GHG inventory and make any product or corporate claims. In substitution, for example, with a pulse livestock option, we could identify feed switching as the intervention at the feed mill. We could integrate any or collect any historical feed ration data to construct that counterfactual baseline, and then publish an EF for the baseline. We could then do the same for the intervention scenario where we do have the pulses in there, and we're basically just taking those different feed footprints, multiplying it by the amount of feed getting used in the reporting period, and then the difference between these two scenarios gives you the emission reductions. You take that through verification, and then you would later integrate that into the downstream companies of the feed company or the livestock company or any of those other relevant partners. Whereas path B here in green, so this is, let's say, as an example, doing enhanced soil and fertilizer management. This could be a monster that wants to partner with a crop input company on a regen ag program that's going to do a set of practices that improve the soil and reduce N2O emissions. So you'll still establish a baseline by going back in time. We'll look at the old practices, the tillage regime, the planting practices, the fertilizer rates and products, and then we'll model that baseline. We'll also model the baseline under the new scenario that does do cover cropping, reduce tillage, improve fertilizer management, that sort of thing. And then we can compare those two differences in each monitoring period or each reporting period, and take that through a validation and verification after we've modeled it and got the outcomes, and then we can again report those into the downstream partners inventory. But the substitution here, which I'm going to let Teresa explain in a moment, is a little bit trickier when you're dealing with those kinds of modeled outcomes, because that isn't exactly the same way as a company would report its emissions. So it would probably just be using a crop footprint, like a barley footprint from the CRSC, for example. Now we've come in, we've done a bunch of interventions, and we've modeled a new emission factor for a subcomponent of the crop, but we probably didn't do a complete crop footprint. So that's when now substituting that subset of changes into the overall footprint gets a little bit tricky, but not impossible. And there's different and new ways of reporting this now, with different kind of ledger-based reporting and impact statements and that sort of thing. So anyway, just wanted to highlight those two options as different pathways, but both are very, very viable and good ways to reduce emissions. So that's program structure. I'm aware of the time. I'm going a little slower than I thought, but we did kind of front load the most important stuff up front. So if we don't finish all the slides, that's actually okay. And I think if there's questions right now, I can address them, or I can just keep moving into some of the more kind of project implementation info questions.
I think you just keep moving from
Okay.
here, and then we'll do questions at the end.
Sounds good. So on producer engagement and communication strategy, very important to have them go into this with a solid understanding of what's required of them and of what the value proposition is to them. So that's kind of the first step, is making sure everybody understands what the goal of the program is, how the emissions are calculated, how do they get paid, and what happens if they exit mid-contract, because often these require sort of longer term contracts, and those are kind of risky for farmers that operate in a very dynamic and changing landscape all the time. So very important there. On the data parameters and record keeping, they need to understand very clearly what's required of them for data sharing, and making sure that their data is secure, that it's private, that it's not going to be shared with external sources or be listed publicly or anything, because that's a big concern from many growers and producers. But they'll need to know what is required to establish that counterfactual baseline, and then they'll need to understand what are the monitoring requirements for me throughout the season. So fertilizer collection, tillage practices, crop data, planting dates, all that kind of stuff. And then whatever their particular intervention is. So if you're a livestock company and you're doing a methane inhibitor, you would need some very particular data points around that intervention. So when did the inhibitor get fed, and what are the specs around it, and you might need to show evidence that it was bought and that sort of stuff. So that's a very tailored and project specific plan you'll have to create for each of these programs. You'll have to support them throughout their practice change, and they need to understand exactly which changes are required of them, which ones are optional, and making sure this is in fact a new practice for them. If they're doing if you want to see a change from that baseline, then you'll need to make sure that the practice wasn't already existing in that baseline, or else when you quantify both scenarios, you won't see that change. So having a list of eligible practice changes for each farmer is ideal, and then they can choose with the support of their agronomist or their livestock advisor which practices make the most sense for them. And then on the verification and audit process, typically these don't involve all the farmers, but the VVB may want to do a phone interview or even a farm visit on a subset of the growers or producers just to make sure that they actually did, conduct the intervention and that the equipment matches with the stated, the stated records and all that kind of stuff, and that the yields were in fact maintained. And so they could do a field visit. I would say maybe 10% of the growers expect that, but you don't know which ones it'll be until you get into the audit. So making sure that all the farmers would be at least somewhat prepared to deal with that in advance is useful. And then on the communication with them, there's many ways of doing this, but in-person group sessions are great, one-on-one advisories. You can do video series, create FAQs, and depending on the tool that they're using for the data collection, it might actually be like a support function or a chat function right within it if they're using, something like a Zarview Field Manager or John Deere Operations Center, something like that. So lots of options there. I think I'll just lightly touch this slide because I think I've covered a lot of this already, but I do want to point out that when it comes to the contracting, there's a lot of flexibility you can build into these contracts. They're not all the same for these different kinds of projects. But one thing you'll want to make sure of is that the rights to the carbon benefits are assigned to the project proponent. And that just allows you to do a number of things, one of which is you can market those as a grouped, aggregated set of emission reductions. So if you've produced verified impact units, you can get more value for them if you market them as a set of 10,000 credits versus, individual farmers that are trying to market them on their behalf. So pooling them is important for that reason. It's also important for the buffer pools and managing any reversal risks. And this is particularly important for projects that deal with soil carbon removals, because one of the requirements from the land sector removal standard is this permanence requirement. Permanence is often addressed through buffer reserves or buffer pools that hold maybe 20% of the total, the overall removals. And when you pool and you aggregate a bunch of growers together, it's easier to maintain that buffer pool than for an individual farmer. And then finally on that point, if you have a set of growers that are all pooled together, it allows you to do some maneuvering with some of the complexities that come out of an agriculture project that relate to sometimes emission reductions not being as high as you hoped they would be. In fact, sometimes a farmer might do all the right things and their emissions still go up because it was a weird weather year or there's some other variable that caused their emissions to go up in a particular year. And when you have a pooled project, you can actually redistribute credit so that all the farmers are getting a positive outcome. And it's sort of like we call it the Robin Hood effect, but you can basically just make sure everybody's positive and that no fields are negative for a monitoring period. And that just makes sure that everybody makes, a positive output for the project in a given year. But I think that's all I'm going to say on that one. And I may pass it over to Teresa to speak a little bit more about quantification. And Teresa, just given the time, we may finish once you've finished your parts there and move right into questions.
Great, sure. So assuming everyone can hear me, I'm just going to quickly touch on the quantification piece. And this slide might look familiar because it's similar to the way Wilson was showing the different overall sort of project types, the product substitution and activity or practice change. So to sort of follow up on that, if you have managed to go through all of those steps that Wilson so eloquently laid out for us, and you now have data to show that something has happened on farms, how do you actually quantify that? So the product substitution approach, path A, is fairly straightforward. And essentially, all you need to do there is get your farm gate emission factor, then disaggregate it into its different components. So you'll see in the table there, I've used an example from the Canadian Roundtable for sustainable crops for their wheat footprint, the weighted average across Canada. And that has already been broken up into the component parts, so fertilizer manufacturing, seeds, pesticides, N2O, etc. So if you were to do just a simple green ammonia for gray ammonia switch, then you could take the 111 kilograms per CO2e per ton and swap that for an emission factor for the green ammonia. So what you can't do, just to be really clear here, is just scale down the old emissions. But if you have a new primary emission factor that shows the actual production EF for that green ammonia, then you can put that in instead of the conventional ammonia emissions. And then you just calculate your new farm gate emission factor using that sort of hybrid approach of the initial or the original and the updated emissions. And then you can use that for any of the product that has been impacted, any of the volume that's been a part of the project. And so that is sort of beautiful in its simplicity, and it's not going to work all the time. It only works when you have sort of those scenarios of the product switching, the pulse example that Wilson gave, or the N2O, the nitrogen example. For path B, the activity or practice change, this is going to be a bit more complicated, but also has a lot more potential to drive a greater emission reductions. So for that, you do need to select a quantification method, and I'll talk in a moment about how you would what different methods you could choose from. You need to get a quantification engine. So whether that is going to be some sort of external tool or platform, or if you can just do it manually using like an Excel calculator. You need to have your baseline and collect your baseline data. You need your project data, and then the quantification is simply the delta between your baseline and your project data. So it sounds quite simple when you put it that way, but there is a lot more to actually getting selecting your quantification methodology and getting the data. And the type of baseline that you use is sort of driven by the methodology that you select. So trying to go to next slide here. This is sort of a broad overview of what potential protocols you could choose from if you were doing ag intervention projects in North America. And just to sort of give some background here, when we are running scope 3, or what we're calling inset credit projects, typically what's done is you take a methodology that was developed for a voluntary offset or a compliance offset project market and apply that to the scope 3 project. And that is because you need to have something to stand on to say these interventions are in fact driving the change. If we do this, if we do the no-till, if we do the end management, this is what's actually going to result from it. And you can't just sort of go out and say, I think this is probably reducing emissions by 15%, so I'm going to reduce my emissions by 15%. You need to show what actually, the math behind it. And the Veras, the gold standards, CARS, or some of the Canadian, either Alberta or federal protocols that are out there, that is sort of your recipe behind it all that you can lean on. And I'm not going to go too much more in depth in that because I do want to make sure we have time for questions. I'll finally just say that after you have selected your protocol and you're running through your implementation, then you can decide how you want to actually quantify all of that. So are you going to use some sort of calculator or tool? And that's where the field to market FieldPrint platform is proving to be very helpful for project developers. And then you also need to consider whether you are going to do something that involves SOC or not, and that brings with it a lot more potential for reductions, but also sort of opens a whole can of worms for how you're going to collect that data, show the permanence and the monitoring, etc. And with that, I am going to turn it back to Wilson to let you sort of wrap us up, and then we'll have a bit more time to talk about questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Teresa. I was going to speak about monitoring and data collection. I'll just show the slide because then you can pause it during the recording if you want to read about these different types of data collection and parameters required. But yeah, I won't go through each of these. I'll just say it's the general kind of crop info you'd expect to need, and then anything specific to your intervention. And you'll also need some evidence to support the activity claims that you're making for each of those data points, or maybe not for all of them, but for the really important ones anyway, like tillage practices or fertilizer rates. Like those are the things that are going to really drive the emissions. And so on those important ones, you'll need some extra data, but it doesn't all come from the farmers. Some of it is sourced through EF databases or peer-reviewed literature and LCAs. Some of it can come from satellite imagery and remote sensing, or soil surveys and so forth. So wherever you can get it, outside of the farmer is ideal, because it just means there's less of a burden for them. So if it's an option to do it through a different means, then I would recommend that, just to save them some time. But some things are just going to be, there's no way around it. But these can become more efficient with different types of apps and tools. And the QA process is something that, again, as I mentioned earlier, is ongoing, and you'll find gaps in these data sets all the time. And so dealing with those is necessary. There's different, I guess, tiers of quality of data. This box comes from a protocol called VM0042 from Vera. So it's their improved ag land management methodology, and it covers many different types of practices in crop and livestock production and grazing. But it, for the baseline at least, sets out these sort of hierarchies of data sources. So ideally, you're getting them directly from historical management records. If that's not available, then you try from historical management plans. If that's not available, then you can use assigned attestation from the farmer or landowner, and then just compare that against similar fields or other regional data sets to make sure that it's roughly aligned. And then if you can't get that, then you have to just default to these sort of regional subnational averages if necessary. But you don't want to do that on, you don't want to depend on the regional or attestations too much. But there are options for gap filling, and most auditors are pretty reasonable in terms of understanding that there's a lot of challenges with getting primary data, especially from historical data sets. I think the data flows and processes I can also kind of just skip over. I mean, this is really just to show what the data system could look like, and everything kind of revolves around a central data hub. And data flows into that from these various MRV solutions, soil sampling, data sets, primary field data, regional and climate databases. It might get filtered through a data collection tool like a John Deere Operations or Field View or something like that, or Field to Market. And then from there, it could be summarized and put into a package and delivered to the VVB. And that's actually where I'm going to end, is just talking about how you put a program together and how do you document it for reporting purposes and for that validation and verification body. And so there's two acronyms that you'll probably hear, PDD and IDD. So these are project design documents or intervention design documents. They kind of get used interchangeably these days, but they basically describe all these different bits of criteria you need to explain your project. So what is the scope, the geography, the practices, how are you quantifying uncertainty, how are you quantifying emissions, what kind of risk assessment did you do, and stakeholder engagement. There's all these different sections that you need to fill out, and then you'll do a monitoring report and project outcomes report as part of that submission. And other technical components are just a GHG statement, and actually the validator, the VVB will also issue a verification statement at the end. You'll have probably some uncertainty analyses, which are in the appendix or a separate kind of technical document. The risk assessment and buffer reserve is also something that you'll need to keep in mind as part of the overall submission package. And then any other safeguards and benefits as part of the project that you can describe in there. So There's a lot of examples of these. If you go to any project registry like Vera or the Climate Action Reserve, or in Canada, we have the Clean Projects Registry, and you can see agriculture projects on there that have described their work to either generate carbon offsets or scope 3 reductions. And then the Sustain Cert is a VB that has a registry where they also can, where you can see, and it's where you can look at projects that exist online. And so they have all that reporting as well. So that's kind of how it all comes together. That was probably a bit of a whirlwind, so apologies for that. But I think at this point we can now move into your questions, or we can move forward into some of the pre-prompted questions that we have for the last 5 minutes.
Sounds good. Okay, so thanks, Wilson and Teresa. That concludes the more formal portion of the presentation. And then with our remaining time, I just want to ask a few questions that have become more central to our work amid shifts in the market. So let's start with Teresa. I'm going to ask, how can the resulting quantified emission reductions be incorporated into inventories?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is coming up more and more because folks are going through everything, all those different hurdles, and then they're like, well, now what? I have an SVT, I'm trying to show my progress. What do I do? So there's sort of two main paths that you can go down. You can get it directly into your inventory, the impacts of your projects, or you can do separate reporting via what's being called a multi-ledger reporting system. So if you want to directly get it into your inventories, you have two overall options: a substitution or getting a fully updated farm gate emission factor. The substitution more or less follows the pathway that we've laid out previously, the different project types. The sort of nuance here is that you can also incorporate that data from the activity changes. So instead of simply doing an emission factor substitution for something like upstream and production, you can also bring in the primary data for, say, the N2O from the farm, and substitute that in to create a further hybridized emission factor. So, the way if you were to pull an eco-invent emission factor for wheat production in the US, that is going to have an N2O component to it. If you have gone out and done an N2O intervention via end management, and you have the primary data to show those N2O emissions for your farms, you can put that into that secondary emission factor. That is sort of different than getting a fully updated farm gate emission factor that, instead of using a combination of primary and secondary data, is going to be a bigger lift. It is going to be a fully primary emission factor, but the win there is that it's going to be a better reflection of what's actually happening within your supply chain. The thing I will really want to highlight here is, for both of these options, you do need to have physical traceability within your supply shed to the point of the intervention taking place. So that is where a lot of corporates are moving towards the multi-ledger reporting, because of the difficulty in having physical traceability in these commodity supply chains that are so complex often. So if you wanted to go with a multi-ledger, which is sort of emerging as a practice, so I don't want to say this is the way to do it, but it is the way a lot of corporates are moving towards. You can do something like this. This is an example from the AIM platform, but TCAT or the GHGP AMI are sort of coming out to look very similar, in that you calculate your inventory and then you separately report on your impacts of your projects. I'm going to leave it there, and because we have 1 minute.
Yeah,
right.
I think that will be the end there. So, feel free to send us any more questions that you have. We're always happy to chat all things Scope 3, and really like working in this novel space. So I will leave our contact information right here, and hope to hear from many of you soon.
All right. Thank you very much, Viresco, for joining us. It's been an amazing series that you have helped us set up. I'm going to, with this recording, I'm going to post it on YouTube and then send that out as well, package it up with the first event and send it to all the attendants. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.